He thought this would be easy, just another quick demonstration to impress the room. But in less than 10 seconds, Brad Hoffman would realize he had made the worst misjudgment of his entire career, the kind that doesn't just bruise your ego. It rewrites how people see you forever, the kind that turns a loud room into silence you can actually feel, the kind that starts with laughter and ends with no one daring to speak. And it all began on a bright Tuesday afternoon inside Iron Core Gym, where the air smelled faintly of rubber mats and effort, where the sharp rhythm of gloves hitting pads echoed off the walls, and where Brad stood at the center like he owned the place, a third-degree black belt, undefeated in local circuits, known for his confidence and the way he carried himself like nothing in that room could challenge him. Not really, not seriously, not until Emily Carter walked in, quiet, almost invisible at first, wearing a simple gray hoodie and standard training shoes, her hair loosely tied back, her posture relaxed, not defensive, not aggressive, just present. And that was the problem, because people like Brad didn't notice presence, they noticed performance, dominance, reputation, and Emily offered none of those on the surface, so she was dismissed within seconds. Just another beginner, just another person who wandered into a place they didn't fully understand. And as Brad scanned the room for someone to demonstrate with, his eyes landed on her and paused, not because he saw something special, but because he saw something easy, something harmless, something he could use to entertain the class, and the smirk formed before the decision was even spoken. "You," he said, pointing casually, his tone light, but carrying across the room. "Come here, let's have a little fun." And just like that, attention shifted, conversation stopped, phones slowly lifted, because everyone sensed what was about to happen. Not a real match, not a real test, just a quick moment where the experienced teaches the inexperienced, where the strong reminds the weak how wide the gap really is. And Emily hesitated for half a second, not out of fear, but as if measuring something unseen. Then she stepped forward, calm, steady, her footsteps soft against the mat, her expression unreadable. And the closer she got, the more the contrast became obvious. Brad tall, confident, commanding. Emily smaller, quieter, almost unremarkable. And that contrast fed the room, fueled the quiet amusement, the expectation, the certainty of what came next. "Don't worry," Brad added with a light chuckle, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll keep it easy." And a few people laughed, not maliciously, just comfortably, because this was familiar, predictable, safe. But in the far corner, one man stopped smiling, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched Emily's posture shift, just a fraction, just enough to signal something most people missed. Her shoulders relaxed further, her breathing slowed, her focus sharpened, and for a brief second, the energy in the room changed, subtle, almost invisible, but real, and Brad didn't see it. Not yet, because he was still speaking, still playing the role, still believing this moment belonged entirely to him. And that belief, that single assumption, was exactly what was about to unravel everything. Brad stepped onto the mat with the relaxed confidence of someone who had repeated this moment 100 times before, his shoulders loose, his stance casual, like he was about to run a routine drill rather than face an unknown opponent. And the class leaned in closer, forming a loose circle around them, sneakers squeaking softly against the floor as people adjusted for a better view, phones raised just a little higher now, because moments like this were always worth capturing, even if they seemed predictable. Especially if they seemed predictable. And Emily stood across from him, her hands resting naturally at her sides, not raised, not defensive, which only reinforced what everyone already believed, that she did not understand the situation she had stepped into, that she did not yet realize how far out of her depth she was. And Brad noticed it too, the relaxed posture, the lack of visible tension. And he smiled again, a little wider this time, interpreting it as inexperience. "You ever done this before?" he asked, his tone light, almost friendly, but layered with quiet amusement. And Emily met his gaze, steady, unshaken. "A little," she replied, her voice calm, even, offering nothing more. And that answer drew a few more chuckles from the edge of the room, because a little in a place like this meant almost nothing. It meant beginner, it meant harmless, it meant safe. And Brad nodded as if confirming his assumption, stepping slightly closer, adjusting his stance. "Just Enough to show form without fully committing, still playing to the audience, still controlling the tempo. "All right," he said, clapping his hands once, the sound echoing briefly. "Just follow my lead. We will keep it simple." And the words landed like a script everyone already knew, the experienced guiding the inexperienced, the strong setting the pace. And for a moment, everything aligned exactly the way Brad expected, until it did not, because as he settled into position, something subtle shifted again, the same almost invisible adjustment from before. Emily's breathing slowed even further, her focus narrowing, her feet placing themselves with quiet precision, not random, not uncertain, but deliberate. And that man in the corner saw it more clearly now, his arms lowering slowly from where they had been crossed, his expression tightening as recognition crept in, but he said nothing, not yet, while Brad, still unaware, made the first move, stepping forward with controlled speed. Measured, confident, expecting a simple reaction, expecting hesitation, expecting imbalance. But instead, he felt something he had not anticipated, a response that met his movement without panic, without delay, a presence that did not retreat, did not rush, just aligned perfectly with his own. And for the smallest fraction of a second, something unfamiliar crossed his mind, not fear, not even concern, just a flicker of confusion, like a step in a rhythm that did not match the music. And then, the room changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could be felt more than heard, the laughter thinning, the energy tightening, the certainty fading just enough for doubt to slip in. And Emily moved, not fast in a way that looked aggressive, but precise in a way that made everything else seem slow, her timing exact, her control undeniable. And suddenly Brad was no longer leading, he was reacting, adjusting, recalculating in real time, his confidence still present, but no longer absolute. And the circle around them grew quieter, phones lowering slightly as eyes focused harder, because what they were seeing no longer matched what they expected. And in the back, that same voice finally broke the silence, low but clear enough to carry. "That is not beginner movement." Brad felt it now, clearly, unmistakably, the shift he could not explain but could no longer ignore. Because Emily was not reacting the way beginners reacted, there was no hesitation in her movement, no overcorrection, no wasted motion, just quiet efficiency, like someone who had done this many times before. And that realization began to press against his confidence, not enough to break it, but enough to crack the surface. And he adjusted, stepping back half a pace, resetting his stance with more focus this time, no longer playing to the crowd, no longer smiling, the casual tone gone from his posture, replaced by something tighter, more controlled. And the room felt it too. The energy shifting from amusement to attention, conversations fading into complete silence, because this was no longer a demonstration. This was something else, something unscripted. And Emily remained exactly where she was, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, her eyes locked with a calm that did not challenge, did not provoke, but also did not yield. And that calm became louder than anything Brad could say, louder than the earlier laughter, louder than the confidence he had walked in with. And for the first time, he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough, enough for the moment to slip, enough for the control to shift further. And when he moved again, it was sharper, more deliberate, no longer casual. But even then, Emily met him with the same precise timing, her movement aligning with his in a way that made his effort seem heavier, slower, more visible. And suddenly it was clear to everyone watching that she was not trying to overpower him. She was guiding the space between them, controlling the rhythm without forcing it. And that was when the silence deepened, because people started to understand, not fully, but enough to feel the difference, enough to realize that what they were witnessing did not match the assumptions they had made just moments earlier. And in the corner, the man who had spoken before took a step forward, his voice low but steady. "I have seen that control before," he said, almost to himself, and a few heads turned toward him, but their attention quickly snapped back to the center, because something was about to happen, something inevitable, something that had been building since the moment Emily stepped onto the mat. And Brad felt it too now, the pressure of it, the awareness that he was no longer dictating the outcome, that he was responding instead of leading. And that realization carried weight, not physical, but mental, the kind that slows decisions, the kind that makes every move feel heavier than it should. And in that space, that brief window where certainty disappeared, Emily moved again, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to complete what had already been set in motion, her control steady, her balance unshaken, her presence absolute, and Brad stopped, completely still, not because he was forced to, but because there was nothing else to do. The exchange finished before it needed to escalate. The outcome already clear, and the room held its breath. Every person frozen in that realization, because the one thing they all expected to see had never happened, and the one thing they never considered had just unfolded right in front of them. And for a long second, no one spoke, no one moved, until Brad finally looked up, meeting Emily's eyes again, and this time, there was no amusement left, only a quiet understanding that settled in too late. No one moved, not at first, because what had just happened did not need explanation, it did not need replay. It simply settled into the room like a truth no one could ignore, and Brad remained where he was, his posture no longer relaxed, no longer commanding, but still, completely still, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the moment, about her, about himself. And Emily stepped back just half a step, releasing the space without claiming it, without celebrating, without even acknowledging the eyes now fixed on her, because for her, this was not a performance, it was not a statement, it was simply a response, measured and complete, and that was what unsettled the room the most, not what she did, but how little she seemed to need recognition for it. And somewhere in the circle, a phone lowered completely, then another, until the quiet became absolute, the kind of silence that carries weight, the kind that forces reflection, and Brad exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, his gaze still on Emily, but different now, stripped of assumption, stripped of certainty. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, no longer projecting, no longer performing. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a question he genuinely needed answered. And Emily paused, just for a moment, as if deciding how much to say, her eyes steady, her tone unchanged. "A long time ago," she replied, simple, direct, offering no details. And that answer lingered, because it carried more than it revealed. It hinted at years, at discipline, at something far deeper than what anyone in that room had been willing to see. And the man from the corner stepped forward again, closer now, his expression no longer uncertain, but certain in a way that made others notice. "You trained under Master Ito, did you not?" he said, his voice clear enough for everyone to hear. And a ripple moved through the group, not loud, but sharp, because that name meant something, even to those who only knew it in passing, a name associated with precision, with mastery, with a standard few ever reached. And for the first time, Emily's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough, a small acknowledgement, a quiet confirmation without words, and that was all it took, because the realization spread instantly, replacing confusion with clarity, replacing doubt with understanding. And Brad felt it fully now, the weight of it, the recognition of what he had stepped into so casually, the awareness that the gap he thought existed had never been there at all. And he straightened slowly, not to reclaim dominance, but to regain composure, his shoulders settling into something more honest, something grounded. And when he looked at her again, it was not with amusement, not with superiority, but with respect, clear and undeniable. And he nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried more meaning than anything he had said before, because it admitted what words did not need to. And Emily returned the nod just as simply, no pride, no judgment, just acknowledgement. And in that exchange, the entire room understood something they had missed from the beginning, that strength does not announce itself, that skill does not demand attention, and that the loudest confidence often falls silent when it meets the quiet kind that does not need to prove anything at all. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again after holding it for too long. And one by one, people straightened, eyes still fixed on Emily, but no longer with curiosity or amusement, now with something heavier, something earned. And Brad took a step back, giving her space without thinking about it, a subtle gesture that would have gone unnoticed before, but now carried meaning, because it came from a place he had not stood in just minutes earlier. And the energy in the gym had changed completely. No laughter, no side comments. Just a quiet awareness that something important had just unfolded, something that had nothing to do with winning or losing, and everything to do with understanding. And the man who had spoken her name stepped closer into the center, his voice calm, but certain. Most people here have trained for years and still chase that level of control, he said, looking around the room before returning his gaze to Emily. But control like that does not come from practice alone. It comes from discipline most people never see. And his words settled into the group, not as praise, but as context, something to help them process what they had just witnessed, and Brad nodded slightly, absorbing it, his earlier confidence replaced with something far more grounded. And he looked at Emily again, this time without any trace of assumption. I misjudged you, he said simply. No excuses, no attempt to soften it, just the truth. And Emily held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, accepting the words without needing more, because she had not come there to prove anything, not to him, not to anyone. And that was what made the moment complete, the absence of ego, the absence of need, just quiet clarity. And around them, the class began to shift. People stepping back, some exchanging looks, others lowering their eyes briefly, each processing in their own way, because the lesson had not been taught through instruction, it had been revealed through experience. And those lessons always stayed longer. And as Emily reached for her hoodie, slipping it back on with the same calm she had walked in with, the room remained respectful, no one interrupting, no one trying to fill the silence with noise, because they understood now that not every moment needed commentary. Some moments demanded reflection, and as she turned toward the exit, her steps steady, unhurried, the man from the corner spoke once more, not loudly, but clearly enough to be heard. The strongest people are usually the ones you never notice first. And no one disagreed. No one even responded, because the truth of it had already settled in, and Brad watched her leave, not with regret, but with a quiet shift in perspective, the kind that does not fade quickly, the kind that stays with you long after the room is empty. And when the door closed softly behind her, the gym remained silent for just a second longer, as if holding on to the moment before letting it go, because that day, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, Emily Carter had changed something in that room that could not be undone, and no one there would look at a simple person the same way again. The door had barely finished closing behind Emily when the weight of what had just happened began to settle deeper into the room, not fading, not dissipating, but embedding itself into every person who had witnessed it. And for a few seconds longer, no one moved, as if breaking the silence too quickly would somehow diminish the lesson they had just learned. And Brad stood where he was, his hands resting loosely at his sides now, no longer performing, no longer leading, just thinking, replaying each moment in his mind with a clarity that felt almost uncomfortable, because this time, he was not watching it as the center of attention, he was watching it as someone who had missed something obvious, something important. And across the room, a few students exchanged quiet glances, not mocking, not amused, but reflective, each one revisiting their own reactions from earlier, the laughter, the assumptions, the certainty. And slowly, the atmosphere shifted again, not back to what it was, but forward into something quieter, more aware, and the man who had recognized Emily's skill stepped closer to Brad, his voice calm, measured. You felt it, did you not? He asked, not as a challenge, but as an observation, and Brad nodded once, his eyes still fixed on the space where Emily had stood. Yeah, he said quietly. I thought I was leading the whole time. And the man gave a small, knowing nod. That is how it works when someone truly understands control. They do not fight for it. They let you believe you have it. And those words lingered, because they explained something Brad had not been able to articulate, something he had experienced but not fully understood until now. And around them, a few others leaned in slightly, listening, because this was no longer just about what had happened. It was about what it meant, and Brad exhaled slowly, a faint, almost self-aware smile forming, not from pride, but from recognition. I picked the wrong person to underestimate, he admitted, and no one laughed this time. No one even reacted outwardly, because the statement did not invite humor, it invited agreement. and one of the younger students shifted uncomfortably, lowering his gaze as if replaying his own earlier comments, and the lesson spread. Quietly, without force, without instruction, just through realization, and the gym itself felt different now. The same space, the same equipment, the same people, but with a new layer of understanding beneath it all, and Brad straightened slightly, rolling his shoulders once, not to shake off the moment, but to carry it forward, to absorb it into something useful, something lasting. And when he finally turned away from the center, his movements were slower, more deliberate, as if each step carried more awareness than before. And across the room, the man who had spoken earlier watched him for a moment, then gave a subtle nod, recognizing the shift, because moments like this did not just expose weakness, they revealed opportunity, the chance to grow beyond assumption, beyond ego. And as the class slowly began to reset, people returning to their positions with quieter voices and more thoughtful expressions, one thing remained unspoken but understood by everyone there: that strength is not proven by who you can overpower, but by how quickly you recognize when you are standing in the presence of something greater, and that realization, once seen, cannot be unseen. The class resumed, but not the way it had before, because something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, something no one could quite put into words, yet everyone could feel, and Brad moved through the drills with a quieter presence now, no longer filling the space with easy confidence, but observing more, listening more, his movements still precise, still skilled, but layered with a new awareness that had not been there earlier. And every so often, his eyes would drift toward the entrance, almost unconsciously, as if expecting it to open again, as if part of him knew the moment was not fully over yet. And across the room, conversations remained softer than usual, students correcting their stances with more focus, fewer jokes, fewer distractions, because what they had witnessed had changed the tone of the entire session, and the man from the corner watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction, not because anyone had been humbled, but because something more valuable had taken place. Perspective had been restored, and that was rare. And then, just as the rhythm of the gym began to settle into this new normal, the door opened again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to draw attention, and heads turned almost instinctively, and there she was. Emily Carter, stepping back inside as calmly as she had left, her hoodie still draped over her shoulders, her expression unchanged, and for a brief second, no one spoke, no one moved, because her return carried a different weight now, no longer invisible, no longer underestimated, and Brad noticed immediately, straightening slightly as their eyes met again. But this time, there was no assumption in his gaze, only curiosity, and Emily walked toward the front, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. And when she stopped a few feet away, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small folded item, holding it out toward him. "You dropped this," she said simply, and Brad glanced down, surprised, recognizing the wrist wrap he had not realized he lost during the exchange, and he took it carefully, almost respectfully. "Thank you," he replied, his voice even, and Emily gave a small nod, but did not turn away immediately. Instead, she looked around the room once, taking in the silence, the attention, the shift that had settled over everyone. And then she spoke again, her voice calm but clear enough to carry. "Training is not about proving who is better," she said, her eyes steady. "It is about understanding how much you still have to learn." And the words landed differently than anything said before, not as a correction, not as a lecture, but as a quiet truth, and no one interrupted, no one challenged it, because it did not need defending. It simply existed, and Brad nodded, slowly, absorbing it fully this time, not just hearing it, but understanding it. And the man from the corner allowed himself a faint smile, recognizing the completion of the moment, because what had started as a simple demonstration had become something far more meaningful. And as Emily stepped back again, preparing to leave once more, the room remained silent, not out of shock this time, but out of respect, the kind that is not given freely, but earned in a way that cannot be undone. And as the door closed behind her for the second time, the silence lingered just a little longer, not empty, but full of something new, something that would stay with them long after the training ended. The rest of the session carried on, but nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. because once a room has witnessed truth, even quietly, it cannot return to ignorance. And Brad felt that more than anyone. Each movement he made now guided by a different intention, no longer about demonstrating control, but about understanding it. And the difference showed, subtle but undeniable, in the way he paused before each drill, in the way he watched his students more carefully, in the way his voice softened. When he corrected them, no longer sharp with authority, but measured with purpose, and the students responded in kind, their focus sharper, their energy more grounded, because the unspoken lesson lingered in every corner of the gym, shaping the atmosphere in ways no instruction ever could. And across the room, the man who had recognized Emily's skill stood with his arms loosely folded, observing the shift with quiet approval, knowing that moments like this were rare, not because they were dramatic, but because they revealed something deeper, something most people spent years chasing without ever realizing. And as the clock ticked closer to the end of the session, the usual restlessness did not appear. No one checked their phones, no one rushed toward the exit, because something in them wanted to hold on to this feeling just a little longer, this clarity, this awareness. And when the final drill ended, Brad gathered the group, not with his usual commanding tone, but with something quieter, more reflective, and he looked around at each of them before speaking. What you saw today, he began, his voice steady, was not about skill levels or belts or titles. And he paused briefly, choosing his words with care. It was about perspective, and the room remained completely still, every person listening, not out of obligation, but out of genuine attention. And Brad continued. If you walk into a room thinking you already understand everyone in it, you have already limited what you can learn. And that statement settled deeply, because it connected everything they had experienced, everything they had misjudged, everything they had just begun to understand. And no one argued, no one questioned it, because the evidence had already been shown, clearly and without force. And as the group slowly began to disperse, conversations remained quiet, thoughtful, carrying a different tone than when they had first arrived. And Brad stayed behind for a moment longer, standing at the center of the mat where it had all happened, his gaze drifting toward the door once again, not expecting it to open, but acknowledging what had passed through it. And after a few seconds, he nodded to himself, a small, almost invisible gesture, as if confirming something internally, something that would shape how he moved forward from that point on. And as he turned off the overhead lights one by one, the gym dimmed into a softer glow, the echoes of the day settling into memory. And though the space looked exactly the same as it had that morning, anyone who had been there knew it was not, because somewhere between laughter and silence, something had shifted permanently. And that kind of change does not fade. It stays, quietly, waiting to reveal itself again in the next moment someone dares to underestimate what they do not yet understand. That night did not end the way most training days ended, because even after the lights were turned off and the doors were locked, the impact of what had happened continued to follow them beyond the walls of the gym, settling into conversations, into thoughts, into quiet moments of reflection that no one could easily shake off. And Brad felt it most clearly as he sat alone in his car, hands resting on the steering wheel, not starting the engine right away, just sitting there in the dim glow of the parking lot lights, replaying every second again, not with frustration, but with a kind of clarity that only comes when something challenges your understanding in a way you cannot ignore. And for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what he had done right, but about what he had failed to see, the assumptions he had made in seconds, the confidence that had filled in gaps where curiosity should have been. And it was not a comfortable realization, but it was an honest one. And across town, in quieter spaces, others from the gym carried the same weight in different ways. One student scrolling through the video he had recorded earlier, stopping halfway through, realizing how quickly his laughter had faded into silence. Another sitting at home, replaying the moment in his mind instead of watching television, recognizing how easily he had judged someone he knew nothing about. And even the man who had recognized Emily's skill found himself reflecting, not on her ability, but on how rare it was for a lesson like that to unfold so naturally, without force, without ego, just truth revealing itself in real time. And as the hours passed, the event began to settle into something deeper than a memory. It became a reference point, something each of them would carry forward, shaping how they saw the next person who walked into a room quietly, how they listened instead of assumed, how they paused before deciding what someone was capable of. And the next morning, when the gym doors opened again, the space felt familiar, but the people inside it were not exactly the same. Because awareness has a way of changing how you show up, even if nothing else around you changes. And Brad arrived earlier than usual, unlocking the doors with a slower, more deliberate motion, stepping inside, and taking a moment to stand in the center once more, looking around the empty room, the mats, the mirrors, the place where everything had shifted. And he nodded slightly, not to mark the past, but to acknowledge what it had taught him. And when the first students began to arrive, there was something different in the way he greeted them, a quiet attentiveness, a genuine presence that had not been there before. And as a new face stepped through the door, someone no one recognized, dressed simply, moving without drawing attention, Brad noticed immediately, not with assumption, but with awareness. And this time, he did not point, did not call them out, did not turn them into a moment for others to watch. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Welcome," his voice calm, his tone respectful, because now he understood something he had missed before, that you never really know who you are standing in front of, and that realization, once earned, changes everything that comes after. The new day unfolded with a quiet rhythm that felt familiar on the surface but carried something deeper underneath, something that could not be seen unless you were paying attention. And Brad was paying attention now, more than ever, noticing the smallest details and how people moved, how they hesitated, how they carried themselves when they thought no one was watching. And it changed the way he led the room, not with louder commands or sharper corrections, but with a steadiness that made others more aware of themselves. And as the session began, the usual energy returned. In pieces, the sound of shoes against the mat, the low hum of conversation, the rhythm of drills starting up again. But it was different now, more focused, less careless, as if everyone had silently agreed to approach the space with a little more respect than before. And the new student Brad had welcomed earlier stood near the edge, observing quietly, much like Emily had the day before. And this time, no one laughed, no one whispered, no one made assumptions out loud, because that instinct had been replaced by something else, something more thoughtful. And Brad noticed the difference immediately, not just in the room, but in himself, in the way he resisted the urge to categorize, to predict, to assume, choosing instead to watch, to understand, to let people reveal themselves in their own time. And as the class progressed, he moved through the drills with purpose, guiding without forcing, correcting without diminishing, creating space instead of controlling it. And the man from the corner, still present, still observing, recognized the shift fully now, a subtle but meaningful evolution. And he nodded slightly, not in approval, but in recognition, because growth like that does not happen often, and when it does, it shows in ways words cannot fully capture. And midway through the session, Brad paused the group, not abruptly, but with a calm signal that drew attention without demanding it. And he looked around at each person, his voice steady. "Pair up," he said, "but this time, do not choose based on what you think you know." And the instruction landed differently than it would have before, because now it carried weight, now it carried context, and people hesitated, just for a moment, not out of confusion, but out of awareness, choosing more carefully, stepping outside their usual patterns. And the new student found themselves paired with one of the more experienced members, a pairing that might have drawn quiet judgment before, but now passed without comment. And as they began, the room settled into a focused silence, the kind that signals attention rather than tension. And Brad watched from the center, not searching for mistakes, but observing, understanding, the way each person approached the exchange, the way they adapted, the way they listened through movement rather than assumption. And for a brief moment, he allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile, because this was what the space was meant to be, not a stage for proving superiority, but a place for learning without limits. And as the session continued, that idea held steady, carried quietly through every interaction, every correction, every pause. And though Emily was not there, her presence lingered in a way that could not be measured, shaping the room not through force, but through the simple truth she had revealed, that the moment you believe you understand someone completely is the moment you stop seeing them clearly. And that lesson, once learned, does not fade. It stays, guiding every moment that follows. By the time the session reached its final stretch, something had quietly solidified in the room, not just a shift in attitude, but a deeper understanding that guided every interaction without needing to be spoken aloud. And Brad could see it clearly now, in the way students adjusted to each other without rushing, in the way they paused instead of forcing movement, in the way they listened through presence rather than assumption. And it was not perfect, not yet, but it was real, and that was enough. And as he moved between pairs, offering small corrections, his voice remained calm, measured, never sharp, because he no longer felt the need to prove authority through volume or dominance. It was already there, grounded in something more stable, something earned through awareness rather than display. And near the far side of the room, the new student continued working with quiet focus, their movements simple but attentive, absorbing more than they showed, and Brad noticed it again. That familiar stillness, not identical, but reminiscent enough to draw his attention. And this time, he did not interrupt, he did not step in too quickly, he simply observed, giving space for the process to unfold naturally. And across the room, the man who had recognized Emily's skill watched as well, his expression thoughtful, as if measuring something beyond technique, something deeper. And when their eyes briefly met, there was a shared understanding between them, not spoken, but clear, that the lesson from the day before was still unfolding, still shaping the environment in ways that would continue long after the moment itself had passed. And as the final minutes approached, Brad called the group together once more, his tone steady, drawing attention without effort. And he looked at each of them, not as individuals, to instruct, but as people in progress, each carrying their own assumptions, their own blind spots, their own potential for growth. And he let the silence sit for a second before speaking, not to fill it, but to give weight to what came next. Yesterday, he said, his voice even. Something happened here that none of us planned. And a few eyes shifted, not in discomfort, but in recognition, and he continued. But what matters is not what happened, it is what you do with it. And the words landed simply, without emphasis, without performance. Yet they carried more meaning than any demonstration could, because they pointed forward, not backward, and the room remained quiet. Not because they were unsure how to respond, but because they understood, and Brad gave a small nod, as if acknowledging that understanding, before stepping back, signaling the end of the session without needing to announce it. And as people began to gather their things, there was no rush to leave, no loud conversations breaking the moment, just a steady, thoughtful movement toward the exit. And as Brad watched them go, he realized something that had not been clear before, that teaching was not about controlling outcomes. It was about creating moments where truth could reveal itself. And when it did, the only responsibility left was to recognize it, to respect it, and to carry it forward. And in that quiet realization, the gym felt less like a place of instruction and more like a place of transformation, where the most important lessons were never planned, only discovered. The gym emptied slowly that evening, not because people were told to stay, but because something within them resisted leaving too quickly, as if stepping outside too soon would break the quiet understanding that had taken shape over the past 2 days. And Brad remained near the center of the mat, not directing, not correcting, just present, watching as each student gathered their things with a little more intention than before, their movements less rushed, their voices softer. And the man from the corner approached him once more, his footsteps steady, his expression calm. "You handled it well," he said, not offering praise, but recognition. And Brad gave a small nod, his gaze drifting briefly across the room before returning. "I almost did not," he admitted, his voice honest. "I almost missed it completely." And the man studied him for a moment, then replied, "That is the point, most people do." And the words were not critical, they were factual, carrying a weight that settled naturally. And Brad let out a quiet breath, absorbing that truth without resistance, because now he understood something deeper than skill, deeper than technique, something that could not be practiced through repetition alone. And across the room, the last few students exited, the door closing gently behind them, leaving the space nearly silent. And for a moment, neither man spoke, because the silence itself held meaning. And then Brad looked down at his hands, flexing them slightly, as if feeling something new within them, not strength, but awareness, and he said, almost to himself, "I thought control meant leading every moment." And the man responded without hesitation, "Real control is knowing when you are not the one leading." And that sentence lingered longer than anything else, because it reframed everything Brad had believed up until now, not as wrong, but as incomplete, and the gym lights hummed softly above them, casting long reflections across the mirrors, creating a space that felt both familiar and entirely new at the same time. And Brad nodded once more, slower this time, as if sealing that understanding into something permanent. And when he finally turned to shut off the remaining lights, he paused briefly, glancing once more at the spot where Emily had stood the day before, not with curiosity anymore, but with respect, the kind that does not need acknowledgement, the kind that simply exists. And as the room dimmed into shadow, the lesson remained, not tied to her presence, not dependent on repetition, but embedded in the way the space would now be used, in the way people would now see each other. And as Brad stepped outside and locked the door behind him, the night air felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. And somewhere in that quiet shift, he understood that the most important victories are not the ones others see, but the ones that reshape how you see the world. And once that happens, nothing ever looks the same again. Days passed, then weeks, and yet the moment never truly left the gym. It did not fade into memory the way most events do. It settled instead into the way people carried themselves, into the way they looked at one another, into the quiet pauses before assumptions could form. And Brad noticed it every time he stepped onto the mat, not as something dramatic, but as something steady, something real, because the room no longer rushed to conclusions, no longer filled silence with judgment. It allowed space. And in that space, people began to see more clearly. And one afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the high windows and cast long, soft lines across the floor, a new group gathered for training, unfamiliar faces mixed with returning ones, each bringing their own expectations, their own unseen stories. And Brad stood at the center, not as someone who had everything to prove, but as someone who had learned to pay attention. And when a quiet figure stepped through the door, simple in appearance, unassuming in presence, there was no laughter this time, no whispered comments, just a few glances, respectful, curious, open. And Brad met that moment with calm recognition, offering a small nod, a simple welcome, nothing more, nothing less. And the training began, not with spectacle, but with purpose, each movement grounded, each interaction measured. And as the session unfolded, something became clear, not through any single action, but through the absence of what used to be. There, no one tried to stand above another, no one rushed to define what they did not understand. And in that environment, growth moved quietly, naturally, without force. And in the back of the room, the man who had once spoken up stood again, watching, his expression calm, because he knew what had changed, not the techniques, not the drills, but the perspective, the one thing that shapes everything else. And Brad moved through the class with steady intention, offering guidance where needed, stepping back when it was not, allowing each person to find their own rhythm, their own understanding. And as the session came to a close, there was no need for a speech, no need to explain what had already taken root, because the lesson had moved beyond words. It had become part of the space itself. And as people gathered their things and began to leave, there was a quiet respect in every movement, a shared awareness that could not be taught directly, only experienced. And Brad stood for a moment longer after the room had emptied, looking across the mat, the same place where everything had shifted. And he did not smile, he did not reflect out loud. He simply stood in that silence, understanding fully now that the strongest presence is not the one that demands attention, but the one that changes a room without ever asking for it. And that day, without announcement, without recognition, the gym had become a place where dignity was no longer something you earned after being seen. It was something you offered before you even understood who stood in front of you. And in that quiet truth, something lasting had been built, something no one there would forget, even if they never spoke of it again.